Welcome, everybody, to the Humanist Society meeting of Santa Barbara. Our speaker today is Dr. Ryan Cragen, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Tampa. People often ask me, where do you get these speakers from? And in this case, it goes back to I was taking a walk with the dog and I was listening to a Seth Andrews, the Thinking Atheist podcast, an old one back from 2014. And Ryan was the guest. And I was just fascinated with the history that he talked about, his history growing up Mormon and coming out of that religious tradition and then becoming a sociologist and studying the non-religious. I thought it was very interesting and reached out to him and asked if he was willing to be our speaker. I asked if he would talk to us about what he's been doing over the last 7 years, since what I listened to was from 2014. And so the program today is described as follows. He says, for a short period in the late 20th century and early 21st century, there were a number of scholars who suggested that any indicators of declining religiosity were overstated and temporary. Those scholars were very vocal, widely cited, and wrong. In this talk, he will briefly explore the key elements of the theory of secularization, examine data from around the world, and then focus on some specific countries to provide a more nuanced explanation of what is occurring. Dr. Cragen is a husband, a father, and a sociologist of worldviews. The focus of the scholarship is Mormonism and non-religion. His research has been published in a variety of academic journals, such as the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, Sociology of Religion, and Social Science and Medicine. He's the author of or editor of numerous books, including Organized Secularism in the U.S. And when he's not working, he's spending time with his wife and son, hiking or tinkering on computers. He's originally from Utah, now in Tampa, works at the University of Tampa. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ryan. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, and thank you for the introduction. The presentation today, and thank you, Judy, for that introduction. I've obviously written several other books, and that podcast with Seth Andrews was one of my earlier books, What You Don't Know About Religion But Should, which does provide a lot of information about religion with a lot of numbers. You'll see I like numbers. I'm kind of a numbers guy. But the presentation today is on a new book. We literally just finished the revisions that were required by reviewers. So working in the academic world, we get peer review for our books as well. The book is with New York University Press, and so we've just sent everything in. It probably won't be out for about another 10 months. Getting everything copy edited and typeset does take quite a bit of time. And at the very end, I'll give you an opportunity, if you're interested in the actual book, to get on a mailing list I will hold and not spam you with anything. The point of the book, which Judy explained very well, was this idea that religion is declining around the world. So I'm going to show some data on that. And part of the reason why we wrote this book is because there were a number of scholars, starting in the 1970s, but really taking off in the 1980s and 90s, who questioned whether this was happening. And we can talk about some of the nuances of why they questioned this, what some of the concerns were. But that's the basic idea, is they questioned this all the way up until the early 2000s. And then I think the data have become just so overwhelming that they don't, but no one to date has really driven home that this is happening very clearly and that those scholars, who were very big names, were wrong. So that's kind of the point of the book. Just to kind of jump into this, I want to talk a little bit about theory. So this is very much a theory-driven book, and I'm not going to get into all the nuances of secularization theory, but I do want to talk broadly about what secularization is. A very simple understanding of secularization is this phrase right here, which actually comes from a scholar from Scotland, Steve Bruce, who says secularization can be summarized very simply as modernization creates problems for religion. Of course, we need to unpack what modernization is, and this is kind of developing not just technology and science, but also democracy and equality and all the other things that come with a modern society. I like to use examples. I do this with my students all the time. The easiest example, I think, for many of my students to understand when it comes to modernization is I say, okay, how many of you, and you don't have to show hands, but how many of you know how a cell phone works, how a cell phone is communicating with another cell phone? And invariably with my students, many of them have no idea how it works. And then I say, okay, so if you don't know how it works, do you think it works through magic? through spirit? Is it some spirit essence that's communicating with other phones around the world? And of course, they all shake their heads and say, no, that's absurd. That makes no sense. But the fun part is they don't know how cell phones work. They really don't understand how they work. But, and this is the key for modernization, they know that somebody does know how it works. And so what I call this is a modern worldview. So even if you know that you don't know how a car works, how a phone works, how a TV works, any of these things, you know that somebody does and somebody can fix it, and that it's not magic, it's not religion. And all of that is built into this idea of modernization. One other quick example that I like to use is this one. A picture of a tsunami. I think this is a faked picture. It's just trying to emphasize it so you can see it on my slides. But I'm guessing most of the people in here will not think that tsunamis are due to angry gods. It's not the gods, right? Gods are not angry, and that's what causes tsunamis. It's shifting tectonic plates and occasionally massive volcanoes exploding like just happened. That's what we're getting at with secularization. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of kind of the nuances that we cover in the book. If you're really interested in that, we do cover this at length in the book, but I want to get into some of these claims that some of the earlier scholars made as to why they thought secularization was not happening. And then we're going to show a bunch of data. So we're going to talk a lot about data, and then we'll come back to these claims and unpack them and see why we think they were wrong. Here's the first claim that is often given for why they say secularization isn't occurring, and that is that religion seems to be more prominent in public discourse. So we're going to kind of come back to that, and we'll tackle that a little bit and see after we look at some of the data. A second claim, we're going to spend a lot more time on this one, is that a lot of scholars will point out, well, some countries do not appear to be secularizing. So if they're not seeing declines in religiosity, if religiosity isn't declining, how can we say that secularization is actually occurring? And then the last one is that some countries that seemed to be fairly secular now appear to be becoming more religious, right? They're on their path towards becoming more religious. And that would suggest that secularization is not just not happening, but it's being reversed. So these claims would seem to undermine the idea that religiosity is declining around the world. And the two co-authors I have in this book, Phil Zuckerman and Isabella Kasselstrand, we thought, we really need to address some of these claims. In there, we have chapters that address all of these big concerns, but we'll talk a little bit about those. Before I get to those claims, though, I want to show some data. I like data, and I'm hoping all of you will enjoy looking at a little bit of data. So we'll have a little bit of time to kind of wrestle with this data. All right, so what I'm going to be showing you is basically a series of maps, and these maps have information about countries around the world. We're relying upon a data set called the World Values Survey, which is a publicly available data set that has data on upwards of 70 countries around the world. And these maps are going to be showing different aspects of religiosity, and it'll come in kind of two sequences. So I'll explain these in just a second. But before I do, I just need to kind of detail something important, which is that in sociology, in psychology, other social sciences as well, we tend to think of religiosity as kind of this all-encompassing picture of how people are religious. At a minimum, it has three dimensions. So you can be religious in belief, so you can hold certain religious beliefs. You can be religious in your behaviors, what you do, but you can also be religious in how you self-identify. And that's what we call belonging. So if asked on in a survey, what is your religion, if any? If you say Catholic, then we would say you're Catholic. That is actually our measure for determining whether somebody is Catholic. It's just self-report. The reason why we talk about these separately is because they don't always go together. One fun statistic that I like to point out is that 1% of the atheists in the US, we'll talk more about atheists in a few minutes, 1% of them attend religious services on a weekly basis, which I think is always interesting. When I was running some numbers, I happened to see that, and I was like, well, that's weird. I think there are plenty of reasons for that, and if we wanted to talk about that, certainly put a question in the chat, and we can talk about why that might be. But the point being is that you don't have to believe in order to attend or even to identify. Another fun number that came out in another survey, or another analysis I was looking at, is that some people identify their religion as atheist, which atheist is not a religion, and that always bothers me. But often people will identify their religion as, say, Unitarian Universalist, or they'll say they're Episcopalian or even Catholic. And then we'll ask a separate question about belief in God. And roughly 20% of the atheists in the US actually report a religious identity. So they will say, I am religious, I have a religious identity, but I don't believe. So those three don't have to go together. They can be distinct, and that's why we tend to look at them separately, and that's what we're going to do with the maps. So each one of these maps is going to capture one of the three Bs, and then we'll talk about what's going on. Let me show some data. This first map is, of course, looking at the world, and it's just looking at one of those three Bs, which is belonging or self-identification. And this is showing belonging to a religion, most recent year that we have in the survey, and that most recent year is from about 2014 to 2018. And you can see that darker countries, that's less than 50% report belonging to a religion. Of course, China, Australia, a number of places in Western Europe. We have Uruguay down here. The slightly lighter gray, kind of mid-gray, that's 50 to 75% report belonging to a religion. And then we have this bluish gray, hopefully it's showing up like that on your screen. We're missing data there. So that doesn't mean anything else other than we're just missing data. We didn't have data on every single country. And then the lightest color is greater than 75% report having a religious affiliation. So this is like a snapshot of right now, but the next slide I'm going to show you is what's happened. Okay, so this is the change slide, and that's what I want to get to and what I think is really, really important. So I'm going to show you this next slide. Here we come, and it's in color. This is what has happened since we started the survey to the most recent wave. The World Values Survey, the wave started in the 1980s. So basically, we're looking at from 1980s to about 2015 to 2018, and what do we see? So for many countries, not all of them, we see decrease. That's the green, right? So all of North America, much of South America, almost all of Scandinavia, of course, and Western Europe. We're going to come back to this, right? And then where we do have data in Africa, it's a little bit complicated. And then, of course, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, a variety of different countries there. There are some places where we've seen increase. Now, do keep in mind how we're capturing this. In any given wave of a survey, you can have fluctuation, 2.5%. So we don't actually consider it change unless it's greater than 2.5%, which means for those places where there is an increase, it has to be greater than 2.5%. Where it's a decrease, it's less than that. But I do want to circle one particular spot. So you can see it up there on the screen. I'm circling basically former Soviet countries, and we're going to talk at length about that. That is where we're seeing, of all the places around the world, the clearest illustration of increases in all three of these, belief, behavior, and belonging, even though the behavior one is almost a negligible increase, and it's kind of interesting. We're going to talk about that. So I am going to come back to this because this is one of those big claims that people held for a long time, is like, wait, I thought the Soviet Union was predominantly atheist. What's going on there? And that's a really interesting question, and hopefully we'll have a good chance to talk about this in the Q&A, but we do have some answers. It's a really interesting question. So that's just our first of the three Bs, is belonging. Let's go to another one. So again, two more maps. We're going to show current snapshot and then change. This one is attendance. So this is our behavior, and what do we see? This is monthly attendance, so somewhat regular attendance. For most of Asia and Europe, it's less than 25%. We see it down here as well. That mid one is 25 to 50%, so that's certainly where the US is, even though that number is totally not true. When we ask in surveys how many people attend religious services, say weekly, people lie. We've known this since the late 1980s. About 40% say they attend religious services on roughly a weekly basis, but some enterprising sociologists, one who actually worked for the Episcopalian Church, and he kept seeing that number and thought, if those numbers were true, we would need to have twice as many churches as we actually do. So they actually went out to a couple of small towns, one in Georgia and one in Ohio, and they surveyed people, and then about 6 months later, they actually went and observed. So they had enough people that they could go and count how many people actually went to church. It's about 20% attend religious services on roughly a weekly basis. So the survey numbers are almost double what the actual numbers are, but we're just going off of the survey numbers here. So that's just kind of current snapshot. Let's look at the change, and what do we see? So again, North America, it's declining. Big parts of South America declining. Western Europe, absolutely. Certain parts of Asia as well, and then of course Australia, New Zealand, Japan, etc. But again, we have this uptick here. We'll talk more about that. Though, do keep in mind, I'm going to go back one slide just so you can see it really quickly. Pay attention to what the monthly attendance is in former Soviet countries. It's really low. So it's really, really low, and it has increased, but just a little bit. So we'll come back to that because I do think that one's actually really, really interesting as well. So that's our second one. This is behavior. Our last one is belief. Okay, and we're just using a very simple measure, which is belief in God. So what percentage of people report a belief in God? And on this one, we see, just as a current snapshot, right? So parts of Western Europe, Scandinavia, it's pretty low. China, different parts of Southeast Asia, also fairly low, but fairly high in a lot of the rest of the world, though I'm going to come back. So I circled this one as well to the US. I'm most familiar with data from the US. I'm less familiar with the rest. We're going to come back to the US on this particular question because that information is actually just not accurate. It's misleading, really, what's going on there. And it has to do with the way that survey questions are structured. The World Values Survey does not use the best questions. It has a really problematic question when it comes to belief in God. So we'll come back to that one as well, just kind of as bonus information. When I was looking through this, I was like, yeah, we should come back to that. Okay, so let's look at the change, what's actually happening. And here's what we see. So again, for most of these countries that we're highlighting here, where we have data, lots where we don't, we see decline or holding steady in some places, right? No change. It's really only in these former Soviet countries, Eastern Bloc, and then a little bit over here, where we're actually seeing an increase, and we're going to talk about that and what's going on there. So that's the vast majority of the data that I'm going to show. We can certainly come back to this in the Q&A if people have questions, but now I want to kind of run through what this is telling us. Okay, so we're going to walk through what are the implications of the data that we just showed? What is it really telling us? So quick summary on here, what do we see? In countries that, and there are two criteria, this is getting at the theory, in countries that A, allow freedom from or of religion, and B, are moderately or highly developed, most of them are undergoing secularization. We're seeing declining levels of belief, behavior, and belonging in most of these countries. There are some exceptions, and we're going to talk about those exceptions. But those are really the two things that have to happen, and we're going to talk about why, and this gets to some of the theory here in just a second. But keep in mind, modernization is the key here. Countries with lower levels of development, we don't actually expect them to have high levels of secularization. The key to secularization is modernization. Countries have to be developing, they have to have more advanced technology and modern understandings of the world, so modern worldviews. If they don't have those, we don't expect the secularization. Now let's get into some of those claims. And these claims, I think, get really, really interesting. So you obviously noted, I was very clear about it. I circled the former USSR and Soviet bloc countries. That is a part of the world where we see something weird going on. Many have seen an uptick in 2 of the 3 Bs, mostly belonging and belief, much less so behavior, because if we're going to talk about this, I think it's really interesting. During the Soviet era, it was actually really, really hard to attend religious services, and we're going to talk about why. The question then is, are these countries, these former USSR, Soviet countries and Soviet bloc countries, are they a contraindication of secularization? Do they run counter to the theory that modernization causes problems for religion? That's the basic concern here. And what we found as we were looking through this is actually no, because of what actually happened during the Soviet era. I don't know if we have anybody in here who's kind of an expert on Soviet era and what they did with religion there. But, give or take, say 10 years after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, once the communists had kind of firmly taken control in Russia, and I'm mostly going to talk about Russia. It was a little bit different in some of the other countries. But in Russia, once the communists were firmly in control, they intentionally attacked religion. And when I say attacked religion, their first approach was to say, well, if we cut off the supply, people can't go to church. So what did they do? Before the Bolshevik Revolution, there were more than 40,000 functioning Russian Orthodox churches in Russia. Within the first, I guess it was 20 years of the revolution, so after the communists took over, that was down to 400. They had shut down, blown up, destroyed tens of thousands of churches. So when we see, oh, wow, lots of people are not attending religious services in the Soviet Union, it's because they couldn't. If there are no churches to attend, you can't go. On top of that, they imprisoned and killed thousands of Russian Orthodox clergy. So they were intentionally trying to destroy supply of religion. And what that does is it artificially moves the country towards secularization But this is the really tricky part that is, I think, is really interesting. It's kind of the untold story. If you recall, I mean, most of you, I'm guessing, are old enough to remember the Cold War. We used to think about the Russians as the godless communists, right? They were godless, and we were the religious West, right? Like, we had religion, they were godless. That's actually reversed now, which I think is really interesting. Putin periodically will say, like, we're all religious, and then in the West, they're actually not religious anymore. But what actually was happening is this. People in those countries stopped attending and reporting under duress. Okay, so one, you take away the churches. We know that they took away a lot of the churches. They imprisoned and killed lots of the clergy. They developed what was called the League of Militant Atheists. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this group, but it was an actual subunit of the communist government called the League of Militant Atheists. Their job was to develop propaganda. They did a terrible job with it, but also to persecute people who were openly religious. This could include taking people's jobs away. This could include putting people in insane asylums if they said that they believed in God. This could include literally imprisoning people and killing people. It was a very intentional effort to try and reduce both the supply of religion and then to try and attack the demand. And why I have that little kind of questioning face up there is if I were doing this in person, I'd do it a little bit differently, but I want everybody to just like pause for a second and think, and you can put this into the chat if you want. Maybe I'll pull up the chat and see if I can see it. But imagine, if you will, that you're in this country. So you're in Russia during the communist era, and you are religious. I get that that's kind of a reach for a lot of the people in this group, but imagine that you are religious, and then they close down the church, and they imprison your priest, and then they start threatening your job, and they say your wife, who's also your husband, right? So your partner, who's also religious, they're going to put them into an insane asylum, and they're going to take your kids away, and they might actually put you in jail. What would you do at this point if that was the situation you were in? How would you respond to the authorities if they came and said, hey, are you still religious? What would you do? Anybody?
Of course, you're going to say no.
Okay, you're going to lie. And that's exactly what Russian people did. They lied. They lied to everybody. And what ends up happening, yeah, exactly, in Russia, don't resist, go with the flow. I like those responses. I've got a fun little story that illustrates this. So in 1953, this is the height of kind of communist oppression of religion. This story goes out throughout all of Russia, and it makes it all the way up to the top communist leaders who are just beside themselves on why this is happening. So supposedly, people are less religious, right? They're not attending services anymore because they blew up all the churches. But they're hoping that by blowing up the churches and imprisoning the clergy, that people will actually not be religious. But then you get this really fun story. There's a young girl, her name's Zoya. She goes to a party in this kind of remote city in Siberia, and her date, Nikolai, doesn't show up. And all the other kids are dancing. So they're together and they're dancing, but her date is not there. She has no one to dance with. So Zoya, she sees a picture, an icon on the wall of Saint Nikolai, and she says, you know what? I'm going to dance with Saint Nikolai instead. So she takes the icon off the wall, and as she starts to dance, guess what happens to her? She's struck by lightning and turned into stone. Isn't that great? What a wonderful story. This becomes like a huge, huge deal in the Soviet Union. Literally tens of thousands of people make pilgrimages to see where Zoya was turned into stone. And this is in the godless communist country of Russia in the 1950s. They're not godless. Many of them continued to believe the entire time. They just lied. Another good illustration of this, it was 1940s, I think. They actually did a census, it might have been earlier than that. They did a census after the first 5 to 10 years of trying to destroy religion, and they included a question about religious belief on there. And it turns out about 60% of people still said that they were believers. And so what did they do in the Soviet Union? They stopped asking about religion on the censuses because they realized that it wasn't working. I also mentioned that they were really bad at the propaganda. So the League of Militant Atheists, I read one story as I was working on this chapter that I thought was really interesting. In order to be as compelling as they could in trying to fight religion, of course, there are a lot of predominantly Muslim countries that were part of the Soviet Union this time. The League of Militant Atheists actually translated the Quran into several other languages so they could tell these Muslim individuals what was wrong with the Quran. And that, of course, backfired because then they could read the Quran in their native language. So they were really bad at propaganda. They just were not effective at trying to reduce the demand for religion that existed. Okay. Anyway, so all of that is basically to say that what we saw during that Soviet era was not genuine secularization, it was artificial secularization. People stopped admitting that they were religious. They stopped attending because they were under duress. What most of you said that you would do, you would lie. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've actually seen what looks like an uptick, but in reality, it's just people admitting, because now they can admit it, and some other stuff going on with nationalism, which I'm happy to talk about in the discussion at the end. But there's been what looks like an uptick of belief, behavior, and belonging in many of these countries, but in reality, it's actually just the truth coming out that many of these people were still religious. And of course, now you can't actually attend services because they've rebuilt a lot of the churches. Another good illustration, I'll give you one other illustration, because I just thought this was so interesting. I didn't know any of this before I was working on this book. There were a lot of sacred or holy wells where you could get holy water throughout Russia during this time period. And to stop people from believing in the power of this sacred water, the Soviet government would actually go and dump a whole bunch of concrete into the wells. So they would just fill the wells up with concrete, they'd cover them over, and it would take, anywhere from like 1 week to like 4 or 5 weeks, and people would come out in the middle of the night when no one could see them, and they would dig up the wells. And they did this all over the country. So the communist government was trying to destroy religion, it just was not effective.
When you're talking about belief, you divide that between belief in a higher power God versus believe in a particular dogma that are ways of doing a particular religion. Aren't those separate things?
Yeah, and we often will measure them. I'm primarily talking about generic belief, I think, generally, as I'm talking about this here. But in those maps, we were just measuring belief in God. That was the only thing that we were measuring was belief in God. But we often will ask, half a dozen questions about belief. Belief in an afterlife, belief in scripture, right? So how do you conceptualize scripture? All of those are considered kind of beliefs, and we capture them in different ways. So that's a good question.
The thing is that your stats, I had been heard that not 90% of the people of the world believe in some kind of higher power, and you're saying that's not true.
That's not even remotely accurate. Nope. We've got really good data on that for, again, the countries that we're looking at, showing that that's just not accurate. A very simple way to think about that is just China alone. So in China alone, they have, 1.6 billion people, and over 70% of them are atheist. So if we look at that, that's already 1/7 of the world's population, which is more than 10% who are atheists. And then we can add up lots of other people. I'm going to skip this last point. So we did actually run a regression model to see where the USSR should be based on its level of modernization. And we found that they're either exactly where they should be or below it. It's a little bit complicated, but for anybody who's really into statistics, it's a fun little kind of side project we did in the book to see where they should be. One of those other concerns that came up, which I think is interesting, is this one. But what about some countries that don't appear to be secularizing? So we're not seeing a lot of change. Well, this is an interesting one as well. So we just talked about that there can be artificial secularization where people are forced to appear secular even though they're really not. You can also have situations where you're forced to appear religious even though you're really not. And I'm thinking more people in this group will kind of recognize this. But it's pretty obvious what's going on here. So we just discussed this, of course, going the other way, but forced religiosity is not radically different. Imagine that you had grown up in, say, Saudi Arabia. It's in the news right now because of what's going on with a particular blogger there. But imagine that you grew up in Saudi Arabia and you stopped believing. And you kind of realized, like, I don't believe in Allah anymore. You grow up as a Muslim. What's the problem with that? So what happens if you openly state that you are an atheist in Saudi Arabia now? Which is kind of interesting, right? That is actually now considered terrorism, and you can be imprisoned or even killed in Saudi Arabia. There are 11 other predominantly Muslim countries where the penalty for leaving Islam is death. It's just straight up death, okay? And another 20-something countries where there are legal penalties for leaving the state religion, which again is Islam in most of these countries. So what do we see? Well, we see a lot of people lying. They're saying, oh yeah, I'm religious, when it's an official head count. But when we can get them to actually admit anonymously what they believe, the numbers are radically different. So a study came out about 2 years ago now in Iran, where they did an anonymous survey. And again, it was people on the internet, so it might be different, but it was an anonymous survey of people in Iran, tens of thousands of respondents. So it was actually a big survey. It wasn't necessarily representative. So I don't mean to kind of suggest that it was, but the numbers are actually pretty fascinating. So it turns out when you ask about belief in Allah or God, about 50% of Iranians say they don't believe, which is shocking because in most of these surveys, you'll see that it's something like 98, 99% say that they're Muslim and that they do believe. But if they know they're anonymous, that is not what they tell researchers. So in a lot of these countries, and I've actually had a chance to visit, I was in the United Arab Emirates for a while. I had a chance to talk with a number of people, and they said the same thing, that openly and publicly, they have to say, oh, yeah, I'm still Muslim, but many of them don't believe. So we're seeing the opposite, which is artificial religiosity in a lot of these countries, and that's what's keeping it up. And we have some rationale for why that's happening in the book that gets into the theory, but I'm not going to go into it in too much depth. So basically what we have is millions of people in Muslim countries that are non-believers, but admitting it can result in severe punishments or even death. And we just saw this with Raif Badawi, I think I'm missing his name, who was just let out of prison, even though he can't leave the country for, I think, another 10 years. But he was imprisoned in Saudi Arabia for just saying that he didn't believe in Islam anymore. Not surprisingly, we also get artificial religiosity. So we've got those two ways. And then the last one that I want to kind of think through, which was one of those claims, is this one. But aren't religions more prominent in the public sphere now? Turns out the simple answer for that is actually just no. They're not. The evidence doesn't bear this out. And there are a couple of reasons why. I'm going to give just one because I think it's kind of interesting. Some religious individuals are more vocal now than they were in the 1950s. And we can talk about why that might be the case. But even when we see people who are clearly motivated by their religious beliefs engaged in the public sphere, what's often happening is that in order for them to be taken seriously in these debates, thank you, Raif Badawi, that's what it is. Somebody put it in the chat. In order for them to be taken seriously, they have to use secular language. A very good illustration of this was the Supreme Court case on same-sex marriage. In that particular case, the opposition, so those who were saying, no, we shouldn't allow same-sex marriage, they drew on, and I hate to admit this, right, but I actually know the guy who did this. They drew on sociological research. It was a sociology professor at the University of Texas, Austin, who did this really awful study. It turns out like major problems. Again, we could talk about that in the Q&A if anybody's interested. His name's Mark Regnerus. But he did a study showing, using bad data, that kids raised in homes with same-sex parents had worse educational and mental health outcomes. And that's what they used as their argument with the Supreme Court to say, this is why you shouldn't legalize same-sex marriage. They didn't say it's against our religion. They didn't say it's against the Bible. They didn't say any of those things because you can't do those and still be taken seriously in these big debates. You have to use secular language and secular arguments, which suggests they're not actually being as successful as people think when it comes to these debates. Now, don't get me wrong. I certainly get, and living where I do in Florida, I see people making changes all the time, and it's probably motivated by religion. I get that, but it's not at the same level that it used to be, and things have obviously changed in specific directions. We can come back to this as well during the Q&A if people have questions, because I think it's kind of interesting. So one last point that I wanted to make, I circled the US at one point and said that the data there on belief in God were a little bit misleading. I want to explain why I'm saying that because I want people to be aware of what's really going on here because I do think it's pretty interesting. So our map showed that belief in God in the US is above 75%. I'm a sociologist based in the US. I study the US a lot. I look at religion and non-religion in the US a lot. That number is really misleading, and here's why. So looking at a different survey, this is called the General Social Survey. It's our gold standard for surveys in the US. Response rates are great. Here's the actual breakdown of belief in God in the US, if you can see that. So about 4.7% identify as atheist, and this is just on a belief in God question. This is not when you ask religion. About 6.5% say they're agnostic. And the way that question is worded is, I don't know if there's a God, and I don't know if there's a way to find out. So it's actually an okay measure of agnosticism. It's not perfect, but it's okay. 12.7% say higher power. And then get this next one. This next one I think is really interesting. 21.5% say they believe, but they doubt, or they believe sometimes, which to me is kind of like agnosticism. It's not the technical definition of agnosticism, right? But it's what most people understand agnosticism to be. So if we actually went ahead and combined this with this, we're looking at somewhere around 27% of the US population say, I'm not sure if there's a God. It's only 54% who say, I know God exists, which that language drives all of us nuts, right? They don't know anything, but they really, really believe God exists. That's not 75%. So what you'll often see when you look in the media, right? So the media will often say, more than 90% of Americans believe in God. And actually, they really can't do that anymore. So now they have to say like more than 80%, because this at a minimum is showing that it's over 10% don't. But they often will lump all of these three together, right? So these people who say, yeah, I'm sure God exists, I believe sometimes but doubt, and I believe in a higher power, they're including all of them when they say the vast majority of Americans believe in God. In actual fact, it's just above 50%, and that might even be down now. The latest data have come out, but they didn't have the information on this question yet. That might be down below 50% in the latest wave of the General Social Survey, which was from 2021. Just so people are aware, just kind of bonus information. Anyway, what's the big takeaway from all this? And then we'll get into the Q&A, and I'm happy to answer questions. Where we do see modernization, right? And remember, the key is modernization and the freedom to make your own decisions. So you're not getting artificial secularization or artificial religiosity. We see secularization. Where we're not seeing those, that can get complicated, right? So where there's not freedom from or of religion, or where modernization is less advanced, we just see less secularization. It gets very, very complicated. And I think with that, I'm going to just kind of put this up here. If you're interested in the forthcoming book, where we go into a lot of detail on this, there's my email. If you do the QR code, you can do that as well. It'll just send an email to me. And all I'm going to do is put you in a spreadsheet. It's not some email list that I've got, where when the book is available, I'm just going to send you one email and says the book is available. That's it. So if you're interested, happy to do that. Of course, you can also just follow me online or whatever you want to do. But I just wanted to give that as an option because, like I said, the book probably won't be out until early 2023. It's not preliminary stuff. The book is done. It's just not going to be out for a little bit. Questions?
Thank you. That was great data. Let's see. Any questions? Oh, we had a question from Amir. I think he was talking about the Eastern or Russian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox. Was it okay with their Eastern Christian moral compass to lie about their religion in Soviet days? Or did they just not care?
Yeah, that's a good question. When okay, so let's go into a little bit of this because I think it's really interesting. The Russian Orthodox Church is really old. It's been around for close to 1,000 years, right? It's a really old religion, and it was instrumental and key to the identities of many Russian individuals. When the communist government went after the Russian Orthodox Church, they actually alienated a lot of the citizens because that was an institution. It was like a obviously sacred, but like a really meaningful institution in the Soviet Union. And what ended up happening is the persecution of the Russian Orthodox Church waxed and waned during the Soviet era, depending on what else was going on. During World War II, the communist government actually eased off on the persecution and opened up several thousand churches because they wanted the people in the country to actually be more sympathetic to their mission to actually fight the Nazis. So there are different times where they kind of fluctuated in what they were doing and what they wanted, but it actually did matter. That said, when the communist government went after the religion and then went after the individuals, they went after supply, they went after demand, I think what happened is it convinced a lot of people, like, I'm just going to have to lie. So if I want to protect because often what they would do is individual citizens, they would find a local priest. So they would find a priest who couldn't practice anymore because like their church is gone, and they would pay them on the side. A black market economy existed in the Soviet Union. They'd pay them on the side for baptisms, for baby blessings. They would pay them for this. But if they admitted that clergy person was going to be killed. So they were lying. They were lying all the time. Everybody was lying because they still wanted to practice. They still wanted to do what they were going to do. But if they admitted it, there was a very serious risk of death, imprisonment, being put in an insane asylum, losing your job, having your family taken away. So there was a lot of pressure to lie. And I get like the moral compass question, it's a great one, but it was a really awkward situation, a very tough situation where I think it actually made sense for a lot of people to lie about this.
I've noticed Putin appearing with Russian Orthodox Church leaders lately.
Yep.
Trying to take on some moral authority, I guess. Any comments on that, on Putin?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
That's a great question. I have a couple of colleagues who are also sociologists of religion who have been talking about Christian nationalism, particularly white Christian nationalism in the US. That is not a phenomenon that is unique to the US. Many fascist governments, many authoritarian governments actually turn to nationalism to build support for their government. And this is exactly what Putin has done with the Russian Orthodox Church after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So as the Soviet Union collapses, many of the citizens in those parts of the world, they were completely disillusioned. They had bought into the Soviet experiment that this was going to make our lives better. And then when it collapses, they realized they'd been lied to for a long time. And their identity as Russian or communist collapsed. They had lost their sense of identity. So how do you rebuild that sense of identity? You turn to an institution that has existed for a very long time, and that institution was the Russian Orthodox Church, which at that point had eventually allied itself with the communist government. So it had gotten complicated over the years, but they had, in fact, they were a subunit. The communist government controlled them, but they were kind of allies. So what the government does after the collapse of the Soviet Union is it actually turns to the Russian Orthodox Church for validation. And that's what you see with the nationalism, is Putin has now become like a very strong advocate for Russian Orthodoxy. My guess is that Putin doesn't believe. I don't think he's an actual genuine believer, but he sees religion as a very useful tool.
He's one of us, you're saying.
Yes. Yeah, probably. Not that we should claim him, sorry. But I think that's absolutely true. I mean, Donald Trump was one of us as well, just saying, right? Like, and I know that's not going to be popular to say, but it's absolutely true. He is not a Christian in any meaningful way, but he saw Christian nationalism as a very useful tool to appeal to his base, because that really was his base, and to use that to actually garner support. So the same thing has happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In a number of countries, because they're kind of fascistic authoritarian dictators, turning towards religion is actually a very useful tool. They also tend to be very conservative. So they tend to be conservative and patriarchal, and that works really well with traditional religion. Yeah. So great question.
Daniel, you have a question?
Yeah, Ryan, great presentation. I love the facts. In the countries or parts of the world that are very secular, like Scandinavian, Norway, Finland, has there been a push of the people to put some other kind of code to live by? Do we see them flocking to something like humanism or spiritualism or whatever? Or are they just okay with not even thinking about God and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I love that question, in part because I have answers for you. That makes it always nice. But that is a really good question. You may not know this, but the largest humanist organization in the world, does anybody know where it is?
Mm-mm.
Norway. Over 200,000 strong. They have the largest humanist organization in the world. And they have actually gotten so well organized that so Scandinavia is kind of this really weird and interesting situation. Up until recently, in the last 20 years, many of them still had state churches, right? So they still had like the Norwegian church, the Church of Norway, Church of Finland, that were literally allied with the government, controlled by the government. Some of them have kind of disestablished in the last 10, 15 years. But what that meant is for a long time, coming of age ceremonies, the same thing that we would see in like the Catholic Church, those were all basically kind of okayed by the government and even funded. So you would get like a training part that was funded by the government because the government was allied with the church. Once they disestablished, the humanists stepped in and said, you know what, we're going to do the same thing, but for secular people. So for secular young people, they actually have a training program where they're basically trying to teach them morals and values that are humanism, and the government actually funds those programs, which is fascinating. I think that's really, really interesting, right? That the government is literally stepping in and saying, we want our young people to have morals and values, and we're fine with them coming from the state church because the state church is very progressive, or we're fine with that coming from the humanists. And if you actually look, like Norwegian Humanist Society, it's in Norwegian, of course, but it is a massive organization, and they are very, very well organized. So that's the first answer to that, is that Scandinavia is, pretty far down this path, and humanism is widespread. Like, you could say you were humanist in Norway and people wouldn't bat an eye. They'd know exactly what that is. Whereas if you say that in the US, I think I actually like saying that, because it opens up conversations, because no one's ever heard of it, which I think is really interesting. But in Norway, they would absolutely know what you're talking about. The other piece to that is that with secularization as a theory, what is postulated is not that as religion declines, everybody is going to become, and I use this term knowing that I don't really like the term, but people are not going to become militant atheists, right? People are not going to be like, atheism is the only way, everybody must be an atheist. In fact, what you see is that people become indifferent. Religion doesn't matter to them. And it doesn't matter in the sense like they're fighting it. It just genuinely doesn't matter to the point where like they know nothing about it and they don't care about it. It's completely of zero interest to them. And that's actually the end stage. I actually use this book, this example in the book, and conveniently, one of my co-authors, she's from Sweden, Isabella Kasselstrand, she's from Sweden. She actually had a good photo to go with this. But I said, I want, and we can do this in here. How many of you are passionate about carriages or wagons drawn by oxen? Like, how many of you have a really strong position on this? You're really for it or you're really against it? And my guess is most of you will be like, well, one, I haven't thought about it in ages, but two, I am not passionate about this at all. That's because it's not important to us, right? It's completely not a part of our lives. We are not interested in wagons drawn by oxen because it doesn't matter, right? It just literally doesn't matter. That's the end stage of religion.
Yeah, there's that term called apatheist,
Yep.
like apathy, like I don't care and I don't care that I don't care. I'm an apatheist.
Exactly. And that is what we postulate as the end stage. So the end stage is not everybody must be an atheist. It's religion. What is this religion thing? I don't know what it is. I don't care. I have zero interest in religion. That's actually where you're seeing lots of people, not, obviously the members of the Norwegian Humanist Association, that's a little bit different, but the vast majority of people in Western Europe who are now secular, they're religiously indifferent. So if you ask them questions about religion, that they can't answer the questions, but it's the same as tell me that how, a wagon drawn by oxen functions. I'm sure I could figure it out if I had to, but I haven't studied this because I don't care. It's just completely of zero interest to me. Mm-hmm. So great questions. I hope that answers it, but that's basically what we're seeing.
I actually have a quick follow-up, if I could.
Yeah.
Is that government funding of humanism only in Norway, not in Sweden and Finland? Because I know Norway, their government is so much better off financially because of the oil they discovered 20 years ago or something. The other two countries don't have that.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that, actually. I genuinely don't. My co-author, Isabella, might. I know that in Sweden and Finland and Denmark, if we want to include them, depends on how you're thinking about that area, I know that their humanist associations are not as big. That I do know. I know that in Norway it is the biggest in the world, but I don't know about the funding. That's a good question. I just don't know the answer to that.
Ron, you have a question?
I wonder if you think that in the United States, if we turn a little bit more totalitarian or autocratic, do you think it will follow a pattern close to what Putin's Russia is following? Or do you think that we'll go in some other direction?
Yeah, that's
to know.
That's a great question. I kind of hinted at this earlier. A couple of good friends of mine, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, have written pretty extensively about what they call white Christian nationalism. White Christian nationalists, basically what that means is these are people who think God is in charge of the country and they think that we should all be Christian, right? Like everybody in the US should be Christian. They also tend to be white and rather racist. They made up the vast majority of Trump's base in the US. And I don't mean to be political. So this is not me trying to take political sides. I'm not trying to be political. But that movement of nationalism and kind of America first, that this is the priority for us, that really was what was happening under Trump, and the vast majority of his base was made up of these white Christian nationalists. They're evangelicals, they're very conservative, and they have very specific views about how they think the US government should be and how the government should work, and they also tend to be very authoritarian. So they actually like this. So you're right. If in the 4-year experiment that we saw with Trump, that was kind of the direction that he was pushing the entire time. He was pushing for, to become more of an autocrat. And there is a sizable percentage of the population. It's not more than 50%, but there's a sizable percentage of the population. I'd have to look at their numbers again, but it's over 20%, less than 40%, who absolutely want this. They are authoritarian in their personalities, and that doesn't mean that they want control. They want somebody who is in control, who is basically a bully. So if the country continues to move in that direction, I think we could see that. That said, even evangelicals in the U.S. are not retaining their kids. We didn't talk about this. This is kind of a useful little thing that we do talk about in the book. But just to give some numbers, in 1990, in the U.S., 7% of adults identified as having no religious affiliation. Today in the U.S., that is over 30%. Okay, the only group, religious group, and I use that in kind of scare quotes, that is growing in the U.S. is the non-religious. Southern Baptists are losing members both as a percentage of the population and in absolute terms. Even Mormons are not really even retaining their members. Catholics are losing members. Every religious group in the U.S. is shrinking. Every single one of them. The only group that is growing is the non-religious. And the primary way that they grow is in the failure to transmit religion from parents to children. Okay. So if they're trying to, which a lot of parents do, that's the primary mechanism. And we talk about this in the book, is that it is a mechanism of secularization. And I go into a lot of detail in the book on like how that works and why that works. But so I think it's a great question, Ron. I'm really interested in that question and what's going to happen. But that is an uphill battle for white Christian nationalists because they're losing their kids to secularism as well.
Ryan, that makes me wonder about your background being brought up Mormon. Can you talk a little bit about what your journey was like in and out of Mormonism?
Sure. So, I'll try and keep it succinct, but I grew up in Utah. So, kind of the heart of Mormonism. And in fact, it was rural Utah. So I grew up in a very small town in Utah where I've since looked at kind of census data, actually not census data, survey data. More than 90% of the people in my hometown were Mormon. It was a very Mormon community. All my family, I have ancestors who are pioneers who came across the plains, helped settle different parts of Utah. Long history of Mormonism there. I'm one of 9 kids, so solid, good Mormon family. Grew up, devout. I genuinely was a believer. I kept a journal, which Mormons are supposed to do. So I kept a journal. I have evidence of that. The nice thing about that journal is that I do have a couple kind of short entries in my teens where I say, Mormonism is either the greatest thing that has ever happened to this planet, or it's the biggest fraud that has ever happened. So I know that there were like just a couple of spots where I was like, oh, maybe this isn't true, but I stuck with it all the way up through, I was 25 when I left, but up through my mission. So at 19, I served a mission. I went to Costa Rica for 2 years. I picked up Spanish. I hated my mission, but not for the reasons that you're thinking, right? So I was still trying to be devout there. I still had a lot of doubts and questions. But I'm an introvert. I'm naturally an introvert. And imagine sending an introvert out on a 2-year mission where I have to go door to door and try and convert people. It's torture. It's like the most inhumane thing for an introvert. Like, don't send me door to door to try and convince people that they're wrong. That's awful. So that's why I hated it. I really did not like that. Came home and I changed my major in college from pre-med to psychology. I wasn't familiar with sociology because I thought psychology might help me figure out this whole religion thing. I made it through my undergrad, so I actually went quickly through undergrad, still a member of the church, but decided at the end of that I was going to go on to graduate school in sociology because sociologists see religion as socially constructed. It's a social construct. Once I realized that, I was like, wow, these people get it. I've got to figure out what's going on here. I made it through 1 year of graduate school before it all collapsed. And it was a lot of reading, a lot of conversations with another fellow graduate student who had grown up evangelical Christian. His parents would only pay for his college if he went to an ultra conservative evangelical Christian school. And he ended up meeting with Mormon missionaries, and that's what actually led him down the path towards atheism. But yeah, after my first year of graduate school, it was over. It was done. And since then, I've identified as an agnostic atheist and a humanist.
Thank you. Yeah, let's see, Bob, you have another question?
Yeah, just if I take a look at religion and say divide it into four spots: the belief in God, belief in the rituals, like baptism, belief in the dogma, and then there's also what I call the pack leader. Remember the thing in Norway where you get your morals from? How do you live your life? You get that from religion. A lot of times when I used to go to church as a Methodist, it was more like, here's how you should live your life. It was more like a psychology session. And so that last one, which I call more like the pack leader, where the one you look up to and where you're going to get your direction in life. And when you go to secular, is government replacing that? Or political leaders like Trump is my idol type of thing, or Fox News or CNN? Are these things replacing that need in human beings, that genetic need almost, to get a guiding light pack leader?
I like that question. That's a very kind of reflective question, right? I like it, and I'm thinking through some possibilities here. So one of the things that we do know less from quantitative data. So I am a numbers guy right now. I do qualitative stuff too. I do interviews and some other stuff like that. But a lot of the work that I do is quantitative. I've got another book that I'm working on with a really close friend and colleague. His name's Jesse Smith at Western Michigan University. He's a purely qualitative researcher. So he does a lot of interviews. Thinking about that question, it really turns to the qualitative data because you need people to have reflected on their experience of leaving. So he's interviewed hundreds of people who have left religion and now identify as atheists or free thinkers of different stripes. And one thing that does come out in a lot of his research is that it's scary. For many people, not everybody, but for many people, giving up what you just described, right? That there's language for this, right? I don't want to use our technical language, but we'll call it a worldview. But giving up that worldview where the answers are kind of given to you. Here is what is moral, right? You can follow these 10 commandments. You can do these things. This is what you're supposed to do. For a lot of people, that's really, really scary until they do it. And then it becomes emancipatory. Now you get to create your own worldview. Now, whether that will be true for the vast majority of people as they leave, I don't know. Okay, I think that's an open question. I think that's a really interesting question. But I think for the vanguard, and I'm still kind of considering many of the people in this group, like the vanguard of people leaving religion, for many people, once they get out and they realize, oh man, all the stuff that my priest told me, my pastor, my rabbi, whoever it was, about how I should live my life and my morality, I can throw that out the window in the sense of like, I can make my own decisions about it. It becomes very freeing instead. So there's a lot of fear leading up to doing it, and it can be hard to do, but then it becomes a very freeing experience. Where I would say, like, this is why I really like the question. This is one area of secularization that genuinely worries me, and why I like what they're doing in Norway, and I'm kind of worried here in the US. In Norway, if you're part of that humanist organization, they want to teach ethics and morality. They want you to have a chance to reflect on what it is you believe and what you value and what should motivate your behavior. We don't do that in the US. We don't have anything built into the structure in the US where we intentionally take people and have them reflect on what should be the basis of their morality. And that worries me. That genuinely worries me because I don't know how people are going to replace that piece that you were describing. A moral worldview. We call it a sacred canopy in sociology, but like how you understand the world and the basis of your beliefs, we don't have anything right now. And I think we could do better as secular individuals to figure out a way to actually provide that.
Base it perhaps on empathy for other people or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Humanist Manifestos do a good job of detailing this, but what training to, what do we have in place where we could say like, oh, you're 13 now, right? Instead of a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, here's, this ceremony. It's not a ceremony, a training program where you graduate at the end. And it's not about forcing morality on you. It's getting you to think about morality, right? What should be the basis of this? We don't have that. And I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you. Dave Rice, question?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ryan. Really great information. I'm particularly struck by the one chart that pretty much showed of almost 50% of the population is questioning their belief, if nothing more, right? And it seems like when you combine that with what you're saying about, people lying on surveys because it's, whether it's here or anywhere else. And I think we know that, frankly, many of our politicians, for example, would anonymously agree that they probably are secular in their values. They, if they knew about humanism, we all have this feeling, right, that people would be much more aligned with humanism than they're willing to admit today. So I guess a couple of questions. One is, given that and given how important, the sort of the electorate is in image to politicians, have you spent much time with the Secular Coalition of America, with the Free Thought PACs, and so forth to help them educate these politicians, where you've got our Jamie Raskin and Jaron Huffman and the folks in the Free Thought Caucus, really trying to sort of, take the lead on this. But I'm just wondering if that kind of information would not be so helpful in terms of, really easing the fears.
The destigmatization.
The destigmatization of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one question. And then the other, I love what you're talking about in Norway, that the 200,000, signed up with humanists. And I'm wondering, I mean, I'm a big believer in best practices. I'd love to know more about that, how they got there. I'm wondering if there's anything about how they developed all that we could emulate, because I think we're all struggling here with exactly a lot of those things. How do we get there? What are the steps? How do we build these communities out larger? How do we really get engaged in the values-based education type issues, et cetera, et cetera? So anyway, I'm really curious about that. But thanks again.
Sure.
Dave's an ex-missionary too, right, Dave? Or your parents were.
Yeah, I relate with you. Yeah.
Okay.
Took me till about age 40.
Oh, well, yeah.
to finally bail. But I actually went, I'm wearing a shirt here that says Westmont College. I actually went to a Christian college there in Santa Barbara.
Okay, totally understandable. Again, these are really great questions. I'm digging these questions. On the on kind of the political issue, I've had some conversations. So I've done interviews with a number of leaders of kind of different secular organizations. I know a number of them, and I've had some conversations about some strategy. Not a lot, right? I'm certainly open to that. And actually, I think Judy may have said, I'm speaking at American Atheists. One of the leaders of American Atheists, actually two of them, have since pulled me aside and said, like, hey, can you help us with some survey design stuff? Right. Which I'm actually surprised they haven't asked me before, because like that's what I do, right? I literally design and examine surveys. So, and I teach statistics, like this is my baby, I do this. But so I'm certainly happy to help. Where I think this issue gets really tricky when it comes to politicians and like the destigmatization of non-religion in the US is we have to remember that all politics are local. So what you're really dealing with is their constituency locally. And the problem that rises up is, this gets really weird, even though we have like the Secular Coalition for America. If you're a secular politician, one, if you say that, you already have opposition, okay? And it's well-funded opposition is the problem. They have money and they have voters. What do we have on the secular side that can compete with that?
Right.
And the tricky part is we really don't, because they organize through the churches. They
Right.
have church networks, and they can get a whole bunch of people. I mean, they totally violate, the law that says like you can't advocate for politicians. They don't care because they don't get penalized for it. So they will advocate for politicians. They'll raise money. They'll tell people who to vote for, and they have all sorts of PACs and different groups like that where they can raise money and actually donate directly to candidates or their campaigns, their own, their PACs. What do secular politicians have that's the equivalent? So if I were a secular politician, unless I'm in, I don't know, Washington State and Seattle, and I know that the vast majority of my constituency is secular, I probably can't admit that. Or maybe parts of California or New England, right? So Vermont or New Hampshire, where a lot of people are secular, then I can be open about it because it won't hurt me. But even if I'm in, say, Nevada, Las Vegas, Nevada, where, there's a sizable contingent of non-religious people there, the opposition is better organized. And this is the problem that we have, is how do you get an organization that can actually provide the resources, the funds, and the voters to actually get behind this? And one of the problems, maybe we could compensate for the money, right? Maybe we could get people to donate money, but can you imagine the leaders of this group trying to tell people who to vote for? How well would that go over? Right? I mean, it'd be a lead balloon. Like, you can't tell secular people what to do. The classic example is it's like herding cats, right? Like, we all have our opinions, and that's why we are where we are. You can't tell us what to do. So that's different for religious people. For many religious people, you can actually say, like, we think you should vote for this person, and the vast majority will actually do that. We just don't do a good job at that. So I wish I had the answer of like, do X, Y, and Z, and we're going to win, right? What I'm pointing out is, as a sociologist, we have structural disadvantages. We don't have places where we can easily gather money, and we don't have places where we can easily gather support. But what the opposition does have is both of those. They have money and they have voters. So how do we overcome that? And I think that's a great question. I don't know that I have the answer at this point.
Ryan, David Whiteside had a question asking about, is there artificial secularity in China? Any evidence for that?
Good question. China is an interesting one. And for that last one, I do have another piece on what you can do with a humanist organization. Their website is in English. So it would be really useful to check their website. I was just going to mention that in Norway, the website's in English. Okay, so let's talk about China. Yeah. No, that's fine. China. The interesting thing about China is I think they learned, and they've got a very different history from the Russian experiment, from the Soviet experiment. They realized that if you try to force secularization, it's not very effective. So you can't blow up the churches, you can't do all of those things, right? It's really, really difficult to do that, and it doesn't work. So I think the Chinese government was aware of that. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but in China, they recognize the existence of 5 religions. Okay. So there are 5 religions that are like, you can belong to one of these 5 religions. That's okay. Now, you can't be a member of the Communist Party and belong to one of them, but you can, as a Chinese citizen, belong to one of 5 religions, but they highly regulate the religion to the point of which the Catholic Church is one of those 5. They actually have a concordance with the Catholic Church that they get to approve all of the clergy who are appointed for the Catholic Church in China. So when I say it's highly regulated, it is incredibly highly regulated there. Okay. Getting to that question of like, is there artificial secularization? There might be some. But you can, in fact, be religious, openly religious, as long as you belong to one of these approved religions.
Not a Uyghur, right? Not a Uyghur.
If you're part of Falun Gong, I don't know if you remember Falun Gong, they cracked down on that. That was kind of not one of those religions. They said that's not okay. Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses would love to get into mainland China and proselytize. They have not been approved by the government, so they can't. And that doesn't mean that there aren't some people there who are like secretly trying to do this, but they just literally cannot do it because the government will not allow it. It's a very kind of, we all know it's a very dictatorial government. So I think they've taken kind of a slightly different approach. They're not trying to just destroy all religion. They've said these religions are acceptable, but they're highly regulated. And then, of course, if you want to be a member of the Communist Party, you have to be an atheist. Where I often get kind of this question is people say, well, is religiosity growing in China? Bonus kind of answer here is that we don't have good enough data to actually be able to answer that. I know several people, including a number of people at Pew, so the big kind of research outfit in DC they do surveys all over the world. They actually brought in a bunch of researchers from China and asked them, like, hey, what kind of information we have? Like, I do surveys of religiosity in the US all the time, nationally representative surveys. I do surveys all the time. The federal government could care less about me doing these surveys. You try and do that in China and you will be put in jail. You have to get permission from the central government to ask people about religion. And as far as I know, there are like 2 actual surveys that have been done in the last 20 years that got the approval of the government. So we have really bad data on what is happening in China. So we can't actually genuinely answer that question of whether religiosity is growing. You get anecdotal data occasionally from people, particularly like devout Christians, who are like, oh, Christianity is growing in China. I don't believe it. I don't believe it for a second. And the reason is because we just don't have good data. Mm-hmm. So it's not that they're wrong. I can't say, because the data that come out of that country are just not good data because the government cracks down on it. But it's a little bit of a different situation than the Soviet Union, where they're trying to destroy all religion. They're not actually doing that.
Yeah, Amir made the comment that he knows of a Canadian who got deported from China for proselytizing.
Yep.
Isn't there still in China a fair amount of what we would call folk religion? In other words, lots of beliefs that are not what we consider organized religious beliefs.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There is some of that. So you do get some ancestor worship. That's more common in some other places, but it does still happen there. That was one of the other pieces that I didn't quite bring to fruition that I was talking about, and contrasting that with Russia. Obviously, before the communist revolution in Russia, the vast majority of people were Russian Orthodox. They were Christian, and they were devoutly so. Before the communist revolution in China, and this is where it gets a little bit weird, is the vast majority of people were Taoists, okay? And then we get into the question of, okay, is Taoism a religion? And I don't know that there's like 100% agreement, but most sociologists of religion would actually say, no, it's a philosophy. So what you had leading up to the takeover of China by the communists was not a bunch of people who are devoutly religious. You had a bunch of people who did have folk beliefs. You're right about the folk beliefs. Those still exist and people do this, but there wasn't clear organized religion that the communists had to try and destroy. There was some, and those still exist. But the vast majority of people had some folk beliefs, but they were Taoists, which is really a kind of a moral philosophy and not a religious worldview. So it gets a little bit weird, but that's a good question. And yes, there is still some folk belief, some folk medicinal practice that still exists in China. I don't know that we know how widespread it is. Again, that gets to the survey question, but that's a great question.
Was there a final straw of Mormon beliefs that made you say, this is bullshit, I can't go on with believing this?
Yeah, so on kind of what finally did me in with Mormonism, in one of my books, What You Don't Know About Religion But Should, I talk about this at length, that I if I'm going to be completely fair, right, I think there are a couple of things that happened. One, I gained in graduate school and undergrad, but really in graduate school, I gained a better appreciation for empiricism, for collecting data, right? For being a scientist at heart. And because of that, I started to take that perspective of like, let's gather data and test these ideas. I took that and started to apply that to my religion. And pretty quickly, like dominoes were falling. So one of the easiest ones is the Book of Mormon. I don't know how familiar you are with it, right? I could certainly talk about like what it claims to be, but as soon as you like jump into trying to apply empirical perspectives, like, oh, let's actually test these claims, the Book of Mormon collapses just immediately. Like it's so filled with problematic assertions. And I think once that tumbled, like it was just a matter of weeks actually before everything else was just like, oh my gosh, this is a massive lie. It's a bunch of bullshit. So I think it was the combination of like empiricism, learning what that is, bringing that to my religion, the Book of Mormon collapsing, plus I went to graduate school in Cincinnati, Ohio. So I had moved away from all my family, all my friends, and I'd say about half of my friends in Cincinnati were not religious. The other half, I did actually make friends with members of the church, but the other half were religious. it just made it much easier for me to be able to make that decision. So I wish I could say like, I, just arrived at atheism on my own and I had no people to support me, but in reality, I had quite a few people to support me. So it made it easier. For about the first 10 years, I was pissed off. I was pissed as hell. I felt like I had been betrayed by the religion, and I was really, really angry. After 10 years of being angry, it was just hard to be angry anymore. And now I'm just not angry. I'm not angry about it, right? I'm just not. That was my life. It is what it is, but I've moved on.
Ron, we'll have you have the last question.
I know it's a minuscule amount, but I wanted you to know there's a coming of age program in Unitarian congregations that does give a humanitarian outlook to young people when they come into this coming of age program. But unfortunately, it's a minuscule amount of people.
I've actually seen that. Right after I left the Mormon Church, I visited, I don't know, half a dozen different religions, and one of them was Unitarian. And ever since then, like if somebody held a gun to my head and said, "You've got to be religious," I would immediately be like, "I'm a Unitarian. I'm good with that," right? Like I have no problem with that. I think you're right. I did see some evidence of their youth kind of educational program, and I think it's pretty good. So maybe that is an area where we could turn for some insight among secular individuals to get some ideas on how to provide that kind of training, ethical, moral, worldview training for young people. That's a great point, Ron. That's a really good point.
Well, with that, I'll say thank you so much for preparing this talk and sharing this time with us. By the fact that we have all these people still here after an hour and a half means we've really been fascinated by what you've had to say and share with us. So thank you, everybody, and see you next time.